Thank you all for coming. As many of you know, my name is Norton Mezvinsky, and I'm a professor of history here at Central Connecticut State University. I also plan and coordinate the CCSU Middle East Lecture Series. Today's lecture is the last of the 2008-2009 series, and in addition, it's my own addition to the series. By that I mean, as has happened in previous years with this series, the money allocated has previously been used. Hence, I, as previously done in the last couple years, have out of my own pocket provided the funding for the expense of bringing today's speaker. Because of some controversy that has arisen over this session, I want to state this specifically. Those of you who have some objections to today's speaker, you have only me to blame. Controversy, of course, is endemic to the Middle East Lecture Series. I have brought, we have had speakers who have presented views that to some other people are controversial. Different speakers have presented diametrically opposed points of view. This is a university, so therefore, so be it. My standard, my requirement for a lecturer in this series is that she or he is knowledgeable factually about one or more important issues within the context of the Middle East, and that she or he has presented orally and or in writing useful ideas and or has engaged in useful activity in regard to serious issues. Today's speaker, Lyndon LaRouche, measures up to the standard I have just set. A controversial individual for many decades, Lyndon LaRouche is a leading political economist and prolific author. He has been a pre-candidate for the Democratic Party presidential nomination. LaRouche has produced a series of economic forecasts dating back to 1956. He forecasts, for example, the present global economic collapse in an international webcast delivered from Washington, D.C. on July 25, 2007. LaRouche was born in Rochester, New Hampshire in 1922. He has authored more than a dozen books and hundreds of articles, many published in Executive Intelligence Review, a weekly magazine he founded in the mid-1970s, which is, I have personally discovered, must-reading for numerous members of the United States Congress, United States State Department officials, other politicos in Washington and around the world, and many academics. LaRouche has been dedicated to a just peace in the Middle East for decades, working tirelessly for economic policies that can provide an underpinning to a lasting solution to a crisis that in some ways is rooted in the topic of his discussion today, the Sykes-Picot Agreement. LaRouche has traveled in the region, visiting Iraq in the mid-1970s and delivering a lecture in the early 2000s at the Zayed Center in the United Arab Emirates. He collaborated with members of the Israeli Labor Party in developing what became known as the OASIS Plan for high-technology regional development centered upon nuclear-power-driven desalination and high-speed mass transportation throughout the region. At major Middle East-oriented think tanks in Washington and elsewhere, factual information supplied by the LaRouche Group and at least some of his views are regularly studied and considered. During the past year especially, when I have been in Washington starting a new Middle East political think tank, I have witnessed this personally. One final word before bringing Lyndon LaRouche to the stage to speak. Some sharply negative attacks upon him have been made by some people on and off the CCSU campus. Material is being handed out, as you know, even though I wrote on the listserv that I urge groups not to distribute material at the sessions of the Middle East Lecture Series. There are other fora and other channels to hand out material. I told LaRouche supporters before the lecture not to hand out materials. I have seen much of the material that's being handed out and believe much of it that I have seen is at best problematic factually and some of it clearly inaccurate. But we can discuss that at another time because unwarranted attacks have been made against me for at least the last 4 decades. I suppose it's fair to say that I am especially sensitive to this kind of thing. My hope is that you in the audience will pay close attention to what Lyndon LaRouche has to say about an important topic. I shall field questions and answers after his lecture, which is titled "The End of Sykes-Picot: Moving Beyond Colonialism in the Middle East." Lyndon LaRouche.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I shall suggest that it is an error to talk about a Middle East policy. That is, I think, one of the reasons we have a problem with the Middle East. We keep talking about a Middle East policy. Instead of talking about a conflict in the so-called Middle East, we should talk about the Middle East in a conflict. And the conflict is largely global, especially within the context of nearby European and related civilization. This is demonstrated, especially since the British took over the Middle East, in a process which began with the development of petroleum in what is now called Kuwait by the British monarchy, and the petroleum development of for this monopoly was to change the British naval fleet from a coal-burning fleet, at least the principal capital ships, to an oil-burning fleet. And the advantage of the use of petroleum as a fuel rather than coal was a decisive margin of significance for the British in World War I. Out of that, with the breakup of the Turkish or the Ottoman Empire, came a new situation in which the British, with their puppets in France, formed what was called the Sykes-Picot Coalition, under which the entire area was intended to be carved up between France and Britain as a joint colony as such. It didn't work out that way because you had an able Turkish commander who embarrassed the British very much during the First World War, who defeated the British and the French and set up an independent Turkey, which he consolidated by proceeding to make agreements immediately with Syria in order to keep Turkey out of the Arab world, to save it from being embroiled in the Arab world, and who also made an agreement with the Soviet Union in respect to that border, and in that place created a nation-state of Turkey, which, in a sense, has been a success. Not that everything has been successful, but that the existence of the state of Turkey has been a success, with all its peculiarities, which have shaped in its history. Now, if we look back on this thing and look at what the conflict in this region is, the conflict has been, since those developments of the late 19th century. This has always been an area of conflict. But people look at this and say, this is a conflict among this person or that person, and more recently, since the end of World War II, it's been considered a conflict between Israelis or Jews and Arabs, which is also not quite true. What we have to do is think of this area, as I said, as being an area within the world. The Middle East is a part of the world. The conflict in the Middle East is a part of a world conflict, not the other way around. But then look at it from a standpoint, again, of economics. What is important about this area, which we call today the Middle East? Why is it such a cockpit of conflict? Why has it been such a cockpit of conflict since way before anybody knew of a Jew in the Middle East. In the ancient wars among Egypt, among the Hittites, among the people of the Mesopotamia, and similar kinds of wars. Wars between the ancient system of Lebanon and its fight in the region. The wars of the 7th century BC, which involved essentially the Greeks allied with the Egyptians against Phoenicia, and the extension of Phoenicia in the Western Mediterranean being combated and controlled by another civilization there. So the conflict is ancient. Now, why this conflict? Well, we have to go back a little bit more to ancient history to understand these things, because men are not animals. Human beings are not animals. Animals have no history. They have a biological history, but they have no cultural history. Mankind's conflicts of today are the product of a cultural conflicts in cultural history. And we must look back perhaps 1 million years to get some glimpse of this. For example, in archaeology, how do we distinguish in archaeology with the frail evidence we have of mankind's probable or actual existence then, say up to 1 million years ago? How do we distinguish between ape and man? There's one simple explanation. If you can find evidence of a fire site together with fossils which look like they might be either anthropod or human, if you find a fire site, that's human. The primary difference of man from ape is fire. But fire is only a symptom. Fire is an expression of the nature of the human intellect, of the creative powers of man which does not exist in the ape. In lower forms of life than man, in the so-called biosphere, the development is built into the physiology and the physical circumstances. In the case of man, as the case of ancient fire sites, which distinguished man from ape in anthropology, we have the secret of man, which is ideas. Fire is the illustration of the concept of discovery of ideas, of the concept of culture, of the concept of development of the human race, development of civilization. And therefore, to understand human behavior, we must look back as well as we can to ancient times to see, as much as we can, this pattern of distinction between the ape and man, between the biosphere and what is called the noosphere, the sphere of the human mind and its creative potential, and the ape lacking that kind of creative potential, and all beasts lacking that kind of creative potential. So then we have to look at this question from the standpoint of humanism. And what do we mean by humanism? We also mean language. We mean cultures which are transmitted by or with the assistance of language. So we study man in terms of language, not merely because of the use of language, but because of the invention of ideas which do not start and end with the life of an individual, but are the transmission of ideas from one generation to the next. And so it is the development of ideas, the development of mankind over thousands of years, over even 1 million or 2 million years perhaps, of mankind, that we find the secret of human behavior at any point or location within history. And this is no exception, this so-called Middle East conflict. This conflict arose long after the period of about 17,000 BC, when the last great glaciation of about 100,000 years old, these glaciations are never quite simple, but they do have demarcations. And we're coming to the end of a warming period. As a matter of fact, we're already, contrary to some rumors, we're in a cooling period. And the lowering of sunspot activity is one indication of a 10 to 11-year cooling period now in process. It's global. There are other factors involved, but as far as the sun's concerned, sunspot activity and changes recently indicate we're in an 11-year cycle, typically of the past, of sunspot decline and therefore a cooling period. We're also in a long-term cooling period because we have another 100,000 approximately year cycle to deal with, which determine long-term glaciation and deglaciation. So in this process, there's a lot we don't know because a good deal of this planet was buried under many layers of ice, especially the northern hemisphere, for a long period of time. And during this long period of time, culture was primarily located in transoceanic or at least other maritime cultures, not land cultures. As far as we know, culture, human culture, its progress, was determined by maritime culture, which in its navigation discovered the significance of astronomy, discovered its importance for man, and for navigation itself. And these were the leading cultures in the Great Ice Age period in particular, when many of our calendars, as we know them today, the ancient calendars and the markings of these ancient calendars became apparent. And then the ice began to recede about 20,000 years ago, and the rate of melting increased. Gradually, the oceans rose by about 400 feet, changing the definition of coastline, making India much smaller than it had been in an earlier period. The Mediterranean was opened up as no longer a lake-like formation, but became a sea, a salty sea. And then about 10,000 years ago, as the Mediterranean rose, it broke through the so-called Dardanelles Strait and transformed what we call the Black Sea lake, from a freshwater lake into a saltwater lake with a freshwater underbase. So in this process, these changes are going on. Man is reacting to these changes. Gradually, as the glaciation recedes, civilization moves into land. It moves along the coast first, as we see in the 4th and 3rd century BC in the Mediterranean region. It goes through various crises, but there's a gradual inland movement. First movement is along the coast, maritime culture. Secondly, it begins to move upriver in the major rivers, particularly the rivers that are now being flooded by the melting ice from the glaciation. And in this situation, something happens. You have a culture whose leading characteristic in this known period was that of a maritime culture, not an inland culture. There were inland cultures, but they were not progressive in the sense that the maritime cultures were progressive scientifically, or equivalent of science and in culture. So what now is the meaning of this area we call the Middle East at that point? It's an area between the Mediterranean, which becomes a center of growing culture, and the Indian Ocean and Asia in general. For example, let's take the case of Sumer, which is the first major civilization which emerged in the southern Middle East. This was an Indian Ocean culture. It was not a Semitic culture. It progressed. It was a very advanced culture in many respects. Much of the idea of language, of written language, was developed there and influenced the entire region for a long time after that with the cuneiform writings. But then it degenerated, and the lower part of the Mesopotamia became salinated because of a physical, economic degeneration of the area. Then you had the Akkad. But then you had the Semitic cultures, which were based upriver on the structure which they had adapted to from the earlier Indian Ocean cultures. And in this process, now you have a development, a powerful development between the Indian Ocean and the Mediterranean as an area. That remains to the present day. Then there was a change more in the middle of the 19th century, or slightly afterward. The victory of the United States in defeating the British puppets, called the Confederacy, in the Civil War resulted in a fundamental change in world history. Up until that time, The superior cultures in power were cultures which were based on maritime culture, because the ability to move by seawater and up rivers, which were the large part of rivers, became the places where civilization, where economic power developed. Inland movement was difficult compared to movement across water. And so until about the 1870s, the world was dominated in terms of powers in the world by maritime cultures. And the British Empire's emergence was a product of that process. But in 1876, there was a change. The change was the Philadelphia Centennial Celebration, in which all of the achievements of the United States, especially those of the recent period, were put on display in Philadelphia. People from all over the world, prominent figures from various countries, came to see this. Japan came to see it, and Japan was changed and transformed from what it had been into an emerging industrial power through visits to the United States in the context of the Philadelphia Convention Centennial. Russia, the great scientist from Russia, came there and adopted a policy which resulted, among many other things, in the Trans-Siberian Railroad. In Germany, Otto von Bismarck, the chancellor, had direct representations and negotiated directly with the circles of those who had been associated with Abraham Lincoln, and transformed Germany with many reforms instituted in the late 1870s. Among these reforms were the imitation of the United States on one crucial point. We, as had been intended by John Quincy Adams when he had been Secretary of State, had defined a policy for the United States as one nation from the Canadian to Mexican borders and from the Atlantic to Pacific Oceans. Not merely a territory, but a nation which was developing in an integrated way to the development of the transatlantic, transnational railway system. Germany then adopted that policy for Eurasia, a policy of developing Europe, continental Europe and continental Eurasia, on the basis of transcontinental railway systems and the things that go with that. Suddenly there was a transformation in the character of economy for as far back as we know much history, from national power based on maritime power to national power or superior national power based on the development of inland transportation, rail transportation, and the industries that went with that. This was recognized by the British as being a great threat to the existence of the British Empire, which is not really a British empire. It was a financial empire with headquarters in the Netherlands and in England. But it was not the British people that were the empire. It was an international financial group based on maritime power, which thought they could create a power dominating the world. So from that point on, the great conflict from Lincoln's defeat of the British puppet, the Confederacy, through the 1876 Centennial Conference in Philadelphia, there's a great conflict between the British Empire as a maritime power and the United States as a model of transcontinental internal development of national areas. And the pivot of this thing, which became known as World War II, it started actually, the first war was the assassination of the president of France, Sadi Carnot, on behalf of British interests, which made a mess of things and therefore allowed the British to begin to organize. In 1895, the British organized the first Japan-China war and continued that policy as a war of attack on China up until 1945. Japan attack on China. Japan was also dedicated to a war with Russia. Then the Prince of Wales, who actually ran the place for his mother, she was kind of gaudy at that point, the Prince of Wales planned to have his two nephews go to war with each other. One of his nephews was Wilhelm II of Germany. The other was the Tsar of Russia. And they were determined to start a war. Bismarck knew this and made an agreement with the Tsar of Russia that if anyone tried to get Germany to support Austria in a Balkan war, that Bismarck would kill the operation. And on that basis, peace was preserved for a while. But then Bismarck was dumped in 1890, and the process of war began. First, with the assassination of Sadi Carnot of France, who was close to the United States and close to this policy. Then with the dumping of Bismarck beforehand. Then with the launching of the Japan-China warfare, which continued until 1945, until August 1945. So he went into what was called a Great World War, but actually a whole series of Great World Wars, which have been ongoing since 1890 to, in fact, the present time. The conflicts of the world today are approximately the echo of this long conflict between the idea of the internal development of national territories and cross-national territories, as typified by great transcontinental railway systems and by technological progress. And the other side, the idea of maintaining a maritime supremacy, a maritime financial supremacy over the world at large. We're still there. Now, in this process, a time came at which Franklin Roosevelt had intervened in this process and had broken it up. Up until that time, frankly, from the assassination of McKinley, which was a key part of getting us into World War I and then World War II, up until that time, the United States was going in a bad direction, or from that time on. We had bad presidents. Theodore Roosevelt was the son of the nephew of the organizer of the Confederacy Intelligence Service, became president. And he was a loyal British subject. He made a mess of things. Then we had Woodrow Wilson, whose family was notorious for its leading role in the organization and tradition of the Ku Klux Klan. And it was Woodrow Wilson who personally, from the White House as president, launched the reorganization of the Ku Klux Klan in the United States on a scale far beyond its existence ever before. Then we had the case of Cal Coolidge, who kept his mouth shut because he knew he'd incriminate himself if he talked in public. Then we had the case of Hoover. Well, we say Hoover sucked. He was a bright man, but he had the bad politics, and he worked for people who controlled him, and he was their puppet. Then comes in a man who's a descendant of a friend of guess whom? Our great first Secretary of the Treasury, Alexander Hamilton. And that friend was known as Isaac Roosevelt. And Isaac Roosevelt had started the Bank of New York. Isaac was a close collaborator of Hamilton. And Franklin Roosevelt, who was a descendant of Isaac Roosevelt, in his Harvard graduation class period, wrote a paper in honoring his ancestor, Isaac Roosevelt, and his policy. So there was nothing accidental about Franklin Roosevelt. Franklin Roosevelt, who had to struggle against a people in New York and elsewhere who we would call fascists today, and they were fascists. They're still fascists, some of them. He turned the tide against them. And while he was president, despite the difficulties under which he labored, he went into the presidency with a very clear intention, of a very clear perspective. Roosevelt, in his presidency, made and implemented policies faster than anybody else could think of them. You look at that from his first steps in there. He knew exactly what he was going to do. He had to improvise in some degree. And all leaders of societies do improvise. They know what their mission is. Now they have to find out how to bring the forces together to accomplish that mission in principle, even if it has imperfections. And that's the way our system works. We are a people with many different views, And the way you get the job done is find a common interest in the nation, awaken the people to a common interest, and then figure out how to get the job done. And you do a lot of bargaining and negotiating in the process to get the thing through. The thing you count on, first of all, when you innovate, can you innovate in a way which is in the right direction? Are you laying the foundation for further steps which may correct what you have failed to do in the previous action? And you have to also educate the people. You have to educate them not by preaching at them and such, but by organic methods of influencing them to see things about themselves and about the world they have not seen before. And as people come slowly to a realization, sometimes with a jerk, of this is right, then they make another leap forward. And had Roosevelt lived, the world today would be far better and also far different than we've seen since Roosevelt died. What the world as it existed on April 12th of 1945, when Roosevelt died, and the day after, on the April 13th, when Truman became president, were two entirely different worlds. And I know, I was in military service abroad during that transition period. I was in India and Burma. When I came back in the late spring of 1946, after a beautiful experience with the attempt of India to achieve its independence, the United States had changed. It was no more the United States of Franklin Roosevelt. The same fascist crowd that Roosevelt had kept under control while he was president was back in power under a puppet called Harry Truman. Harry S. Truman, no point, no, middle initial, no name. His mother had planned to have somebody with a name with S in it at a point at some time. She never got around to filling out what the rest of the S was. I don't think she cared. I don't think he cared. So we had this process. Truman was a catastrophe. Eisenhower was a relief, but he came in weak. He didn't have the strings to control the situation politically. He did many good things, but he was not in control of the presidency. Kennedy got the idea that he was going to control the presidency, and he got himself killed by having that kind of commitment. When Kennedy was killed, Johnson was not a bad person. He's a politician with all that goes good and bad with that appellation. But he was convinced that the three guys who killed Kennedy, who are of French provenance in the attempts to kill de Gaulle, would get him next. 3 guns pointed at his neck was the thing he referred to before he left office that had frightened him all along. So he gave in on the Vietnam War. Then we had the 68 phenomenon. And what happened after that? Then we had a fascist president called Nixon. The guy was a fascist, don't kid yourself. He was exactly that. Then we had Ford. He didn't exactly know what was going on there. He was a pleasant guy, but a lot of bad things happened under him. He didn't notice what was going on. The guy's sitting there, and he's happily sitting at the dinner table, and the rats are running all over it. He doesn't notice them. Then you had Reagan, who was a complex creature with some good instincts. He belonged to my generation, an older version of it, and was very strong on the Roosevelt. But as we saw immediately, he adapted to the Truman administration very quickly. And that was his problem. I had some dealings with him which were very important and could have changed history for the better. They did change history. But we could have done much better if he'd been able to stick to his guns. But otherwise, he was a mistake. They just went rolling on. Then 1987, we had a recession which was as bad and worse than the Depression of 1929. And then we had a terrible man, Alan Greenspan, and what he came out of, that cult he came out of, was not very good. The result was terrible. So we've gone through a process of degeneration of the United States since the death of Roosevelt, with ups and downs in between. But the cultural degeneration is great. Look, for example, you're sitting here in a university, and think about the product, what came out of universities about the time I was coming back from military service to today. What's a typical situation? What kind of professions do people undertake leaving a university? I'll give you a case. We just had an affair that I participated in directly in Ukraine, a scientific case. And we looked at the population composition of Ukraine in different age groups. We found that the scientists, those who could actually think in terms which were significant to Ukraine, were usually over 60 years of age, and the leaders were in their 80s, like me. Russia, you find a similar phenomenon. In the post-Soviet period, there was this orientation, which had started in Russia earlier, under Andropov and then Gorbachev, the destruction of the ability to produce, the destruction of the power of creative progress, and replaced by greed to get money for money's sake and for the sake of the power of money, not to build a nation, not to make conditions better. And we had the same thing in the United States in general. We're now at a point that our nation is disintegrating. It has actually been disintegrating in direction of growth since April 12th of 1945, since Truman became president. I could go through the details of that, but I won't here because that's too far from the subject. But we have been destroyed step by step by step by step. And because it came on slowly, like the boiled frog, we didn't react. We just sat in the pool while the water came to a boil, sitting there contentedly, owning the pool while the water reached boiling point and the frog died. We're like the frog that died in the pool. We've been going step by step down the wrong way. Now, come back then to the situation in the so-called Middle East, and see the Middle East not as having its own history, but as the Middle East as something within the process of history. And the other part is, don't look at the Israeli-Arab conflict. Don't ignore it, but don't look at it. Because the conflict is not determined by the Israelis or Arabs. It's determined by international forces which look at this region how? As a crossover point between the Mediterranean and the Indian Ocean. The relationship of Europe to Asia, the relationship of Europe to East Africa, and so forth. Therefore, what you're seeing is that. Now, go back and say, where did the British get this idea? As they did with Sykes-Picot. Where did they get the bright idea of keeping the Arab population and the Israeli, what became the Israeli population, at odds with each other permanently, killing each other over land that wasn't worth fighting over in terms of its quality? Ask yourself, what is the development of this territory? What is the development of the conditions of life of the people? What is the development of the conditions of life of the typical Israeli? Look at the Israeli of the 1950s and 60s and into the 70s, the early 70s, where there was progress. What do you see today? You see decadence, accelerating decadence, and an increase in warfare. What do you see in the Arab condition? Decadence. And you sit there with despair and say, are these people just going to kill themselves into extinction? Kill each other into extinction? What's wrong here? Well, somebody's playing them. Somebody's playing and orchestrating the situation. Who? How do the British come in on this? Well, go back, for example, to the time that Lord Shelburne, who was the boss of the British Empire, at that time was not the empire of the British monarchy. It was the empire of the British East India Company, which had private armies and private navies and private funds and a lot of drugs. What did we learn from that? Well, how did Shelburne come into power? How did he become this leader in February of 1763 of the British what became the British Empire, which was really the empire of the British East India Company, not the empire of the British monarchy. That came later with Victoria. It came because of the 7 Years' War. What was the 7 Years' War? The Anglo-Dutch interests, which were largely banking financial interests, orchestrated a period of warfare among the nations of continental Europe, back and forth, playing the very skilled military commander of Prussia, the Great, in perpetual warfare, which resulted in the ruin of the nations of continental Europe through mutual warfare and its effects, such that in February 1763, the British walked in and dictated a treaty called the Peace of Paris, which established the British East India Company as a private empire, which led later to the formation under Victoria of the so-called British Empire. Since that time, this group, which is not a group of people as such, I don't think of British bankers as people, because they don't act like people. They act like clever apes, but with the instincts of apes. That what was done in this whole period, especially in dealing with the Lincoln process, the Lincoln effect, and the 1873 effect, was not to engage a direct war against the United States, which they intended to destroy, but to subvert it, to neutralize the U.S. in its own development by various kinds of crises. But mainly was to destroy continental Europe, and to destroy it by warfare like the 7 Years' War in Europe. For example, shortly after 1890, when Bismarck was commenting on what had happened to him, he said, well, the purpose of this thing was to ruin continental Europe through a new 7 Years' War, like that which had led to that. We also had another example of this, the case of Napoleon Bonaparte. Napoleon Bonaparte was not an enemy of Britain. He was a tool of Britain. He ran a 7 Years' War on the continent of Europe as the dictator, to the point that he ruined Europe, so Britain emerged as triumphant in 1815. And it was only the emergence of the United States as a power, especially after 1876, that checked. And therefore the British were determined to destroy us then. But they weren't quite ready. When we had the death of McKinley, the assassination of McKinley, and the introduction of British puppets, such as Teddy Roosevelt, Woodrow Wilson, Coolidge, and so forth, as presidents, and what that signified. And we became a tool of the British imperial policy, rather than representing our own interests or representing what we should represent in our dedication to the establishment of a system of republics throughout the planet. So what happened? The British created, beginning in the late part of the 19th century, what became the Sykes-Picot treatment. Now, one thing is crucial about this, in all of this, which angers me greatly because I'm angered not at them, I despise them, but I'm angered at my own people, who like fools will kill each other over things that are not really worth fighting about, when there are all other solutions to the problems, and thus making themselves the common prey in their own fighting of each other of an empire. It's like the principle of the 7 Years' War. Get the other guys to kill each other, then you come in and take over the mess. That's the way the British Empire has always operated. This was conscious, too, because remember that Shelburne's advice and counsel was the model of Julian the Apostate, the Emperor Julian the Apostate. What did Julian do which caused Shelburne to admire him so much? What he did was he abandoned Christianity. He canceled it, but not really. What he did is he put it into a kind of temple of various religions and began to play with these against each other. Now, Shelburne's conviction was, on the basis of the study of the rise and fall of the Roman Empire, was that the way the British Empire should operate was the way it had operated in the 7 Years' War, and the way it was to operate in terms of the Napoleonic Wars. and so forth, was to get the fools to kill each other, to play one against the other. Now, this is easy to do. If you get people who don't understand the principle of Westphalia, the 1648 Peace of Westphalia, you don't understand this. Our interest as human beings is not to kill each other or not to engage in killing each other for the purpose of trying to get power over other people. Our purpose should be to set up a system of sovereign nation states under which each group of people has, using their own language and their own culture, is self-represented. But these nations, as such, so formed, must have also a common interest in the betterment of the general condition of mankind. The only thing that's worth fighting for is to prevent evil from happening to this effort, and to promote this effort for the common aims of mankind. Because the human mind is based on creativity, and because creativity is associated with the classical poetry, the best expression of classical poetry of a language culture. In order to evoke creativity in our people, so that our people may prosper and humanity may prosper, we have to promote the welfare of the other nation as much or more than our own. Because it's by promoting in them that which is good, which is creativity, which is the development of culture, the development of a physical contribution to human effort. That's what our purpose should be. Our purpose is not to compete with each other as such. Yes, compete in another sense, but not to compete as hostile forces, but to compete in doing good and sharing the good and realizing that we must develop our people's creative powers through the age of enriching the use of language, especially as typified by poetry and music, to think. And that should be our purpose. The problem, you look at this thing in the Middle East, you say, this is a disaster. What are these two groups of people going to do with this damn warfare? They're going to destroy each other. They're going to destroy civilization by spreading this disease. What are they fighting for? To kill somebody else? To eliminate somebody else? Or are they fighting to make their own people more successful as human beings by finding ways of cooperation with people of a different religious or similar culture? The principle of Westphalia. So we get so involved with the issues of the Middle East, which we find we can never solve. The way we're playing it, we'll never solve it. We will make efforts. Maybe the United States, if it had the right president, could force a peace with the support of other nations. But without some force, there's no tendency for agreement in this region. There's a tendency for perpetual killing. And what many of us can do is try to ameliorate that thing and slow down the killing rate, to try to keep it from spreading, to get them not to do it for another day. There are no guarantees. There is a solution in principle. And the solution is end this blasted imperialist system. And understand that we, as a people, must develop our spiritual culture. That is the creative powers of mankind. To carry further the development of mankind from some brutish character by a campfire 1,000,000 years ago or so, into mankind as we desired that mankind should develop today. That's the issue. In the meantime, we will fight. We will do everything possible to try to get peace in this area because we want to stop the killing. But we're not going to tell somebody we've got a solution that is going to be accepted, is going to work. We're going to say we've got a hopeless cause and we're going to continue to fight for it. But you have to understand the problem comes not from these people, except that they're playing themselves for fools and fighting each other. They're both extremely poor. Do you know what the condition of the average Arab is in that region? Do you know what the condition of life is, the deteriorating condition of life of the Israeli? What the hell are they fighting about? Where's the benefit in the fighting? But the passions are deeply embedded. The habits are deeply embedded. We can try to impose the influence of restraints. try to prevent these crazy Israelis from thinking about an attack on Iran, because that would be really a hellhole operation. In other words, he tried to intervene through diplomacy and through other influences to moderate the tendency for self-destruction of peoples. But don't believe that there's some solution for the Israeli-Arab conflict. There is no solution in that per se. That's why I said at the beginning here, don't look at the history of the Middle East. Look at the Middle East in history, and there you find the solution. Because it's being played, the whole region, being played by a puppet. I've got a similar situation in India. I've got a worse situation in Pakistan. Pakistan is about to die. It's about to be killed by U.S. advice and British management. The dumping of Musharraf was insane. He's not a good person, but he kept the country together. And the disintegration of Pakistan would uncork all kinds of hell in the entire region. So that's the point. We must grow up, and those of you who are in the university circuit, presumably approaching now the point of where people are graduating from either from that term in the university or going on to some other education, should think of yourself not as just being university graduates or prospective graduates, but think of yourself as respecting the need for young Americans in particular to get out of the habits of thinking which have dominated our press and our conversations in recent time, to realize we're on the edge of a disaster beyond belief, and to realize that what's needed is an understanding of history, not an understanding of something that's happening in some section of history. We have, for example, the power of the United States, just in conclusion. The United States has great power that it doesn't know it has. I'm greatly worried about this president because I think he's cuckoo at this point. He's being managed by a bunch of people who are evil. But we have a mission. For example, we have now a disintegrating world financial monetary system. We have gone through a depression phase since July of 2007. We're now entering a hyperinflationary phase. It's a process which has a striking resemblance to what happened in Germany in the early days of the Weimar Republic. The Weimar conditionalities imposed by Versailles put Germany at that time first through a Great Depression. We in the United States have, since the summer of 2007, the United States has gone through a Great Depression. The collapse of the economy, the collapse in the conditions of life, the accelerating rate of collapse of the conditions of life now have been those of a depression, a deep depression like that which Germany experienced in the early 1920s. But then, in the spring of 1923, there was a change. And between the spring of 23 and November of 1923, the German mark disintegrated. The economy disintegrated and was bailed out by outside forces. It wasn't really bailed out because what happened is the people who had left came back and took over. And this led to Hitler. That was the year that Hitler came to power. In fact, became a phenomenon. 1923. And it was that made Hitler possible. That, allowing that to happen, which was done by the Versailles Treaty, which you don't do. So now we're in a situation in which we have to change our monetary system. We can reorganize our monetary system and the world monetary system. We can cooperate with Russia, with China and India and other countries whose situation as it stands now is hopeless. There's no future for China under the present conditions. It has lost the means of employment of a large part of its population. It cannot carry itself under these conditions, and there's no prospect for increase of markets for Chinese goods. Russia is also in that kind of condition. India, because it has a low export dependency, relatively speaking, is not as badly off. But the blow up of Pakistan will have an effect on India that'll blow India up too. That's Asia, a major part of the world's population. Africa is already a disaster. So how do we do this? Well, we have a system we call the American system, defined by Hamilton. We can shift the world economy from being a monetary economy to a credit system, as specified by Alexander Hamilton. That is, we do not try to run a money system. The money system is finished. This monetary system as it exists cannot be saved. It's doomed. But some people are greatly attached to it. It's like being attached to a certain lead weight. It may drown you, like trying to carry it. And therefore, we can go back to a Hamiltonian approach, the same approach that Hamilton used, which led to the formation of our federal Constitution. That is, Hamilton was in a situation in which he was a key figure in Washington's policy. And he had a situation in which the banks of the United States, which were state banks, state-chartered banks, were essentially bankrupted by the costs of fighting the War of Independence. Therefore, he had to create a national government, a federal government, which by being able to reorganize bankrupt banks to prevent a chain reaction collapse, would save the United States from disintegration. It was this consideration of the bankruptcy of the state banks of the former colonies at that time which prompted and motivated the formation of the federal Constitution. Our system from the beginning was therefore a credit system, as our Constitution provides. You cannot print money as such. You can utter money, you can utter credit by a vote of the Congress and the President. But what you can do and how far you can go is limited by this vote, by this action. So we create a debt commitment of the federal government. This is our system. It's a credit system, not a monetary system. European systems are monetary systems. They don't work. We have experimented with monetary systems, and we have destroyed our nation by doing so under this period. Because we did not think about physical values. We thought about money values and said the money values will save us. The money values will help us. Like this printing of fake money now, which will never be paid. Debt will never be paid under these conditions, not the existing debt. Therefore, we have to go back to the same thing. Again, go back to a credit system, as Roosevelt had intended on April 12th, 1945, as opposed to what Truman did on April 13th. And that difference between April 12th and April 13th is the key to understanding U.S. history since that point. We go to a credit system. We can organize credit agreements, like treaty agreements, with Russia, China, India, and other countries. Europe can't do it. Europe's in a hopeless situation, Central and Western Europe right now. But if we do this, they will come in on it. We can rescue the system. We have to move, therefore, from thinking about conflict among nations and regions to the alternative to conflict, by finding that which unites us to our common purpose as independent sovereign nations, rather than seeking resolution of the conflict which we are now enjoying among ourselves. It's the only chance we have. And when you look at the possibilities for this region of Southwest Asia, the only chance will come not from inside Southwest Asia. We will do and must do what we can with that area to try to stop the bloodshed, the agony, and prevent the wars. But we will not succeed until we've changed the history, that is the world in which this region is contained. And that's my mission. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you. All right, thank you. We're going to take questions from the audience. I'll try, to the best of my ability, to recognize students, at least 50% in terms of questions asked. So the floor is open, and we have two people with microphones. So when you ask your question, you'll ask it into a microphone so everyone can hear it.
Yeah, shortly after 9/11, September 11th, 2001, I think I was on your site, and what was your, I want you to be accurate about what your take was about that day, September 11th, 2001. Were you on the radio somewhere that day while 9/11 was happening? You were being interviewed somewhere in the world on the radio while that happened, and your comments about that day, if you recall?
You understand the question? Okay. Maybe we can give you a mic. Would you rather sit? Okay.
It's good for me to bounce around. At my age, it may keep me alive, you know, which my enemies may not like. Now, the problem here on the 9/11 thing, on the 3rd of January of 2001, I warned that the United States must expect soon, within probably that year, a terrorist attack which would enable the George W. Bush administration to take control of the United States. I was looking around the world at the conditions where this might be orchestrated. There were several. I didn't get the one that was key. I didn't look at the Saudi aspect of it. I didn't look at Prince Bandar. Because a certain section of the British intelligentsia, together with a certain section, a certain faction of Saudi Arabia associated with Prince Bandar, had set up, and the facts are all there that you need to know. The facts are there. 9/11 was a setup. And the purpose of the setup was to deliver a shock to the United States, which would enable what was intended to become the Bush administration to take over. But no one had the guts to say so publicly. Some people had suggestions of what this meant, and they were all the wrong suggestions. They were looking for a certain kind of conspiracy. They weren't looking for a top-down inside job. And the inside job were the British and the Saudis and certain people associated with the Bush family in the United States. They pulled it. Without that, the Bush dictatorship would never have occurred. Bush was a wimp, a total incompetent. He was an unproven alcoholic and a dope addict. He had been sent down away from the Texas Air Guard, which he had assigned to. He was sent for a 1-year cure for cocaine, and he was never cured. He was just induced to behave himself. So this guy, this incompetent, was made into the president after getting him in there. And that corruption that he represented, together with Cheney and together with the British, was the fruit of our failure to deal with that. We behaved similarly in the case of the assassination of Kennedy. There was no lone assassin. There were no borrowings, no thing that would go with a loan. This was done by this essentially a French-based unit, the same unit that was out to get de Gaulle. And that's why Johnson was concerned that 3 rifles were aimed at his neck if he didn't behave himself. So this was an operation against the United States of what some people would call a geopolitical significance. I know exactly what was done, and I don't know all the details, but I know exactly how this thing was done. We've investigated the thing, we've got the track on it, and nobody has the guts to say it. So what I say, and what other people say, is in recognizing that that is the fact, not by going out in the street and saying, this is what happened. Won't work. Too late. But by recognizing this is the fact, you act according to your understanding of the way things are being manipulated. And that's providing political leadership within the country which will understand that we are in a fight to save our civilization. And we have to take the positive actions, not necessarily the negative ones, the positive actions which will contribute to that effect.
Thank you. Next question? Yes, right here. Okay, review, and then we'll come back to you. Go ahead.
Sir, one of the taglines of the Republican Party lately in fighting Obama's stimulus plan has been to attack the New Deal and create, I guess, new history in saying that it didn't work. What are your thoughts on that?
Okay. Well, it's not exactly the way it is. It may look like that to some people. What we have here is the present administration is non-functional. There are two things you can say about it. Obama and his immediate economic advisors, led by Larry Summers, are an absolute disaster. And the sooner that Summers and these so-called economists, behaviorists, are out of government, the better. Now you look at the rest of the present administration and look at what the implications are of this difference. You have Hillary Clinton, who is doing an excellent job as Secretary of State. She's only one of a number of people who are also doing an excellent job in their functions in the federal government, the federal executive. There are a few lumps in there. There always are a few lumps in any government. But we have essentially the core of a good government, which is assembled around the candidacy of President Obama. He's turned out to be what I feared he would be, but I gave him the benefit of the doubt. And then when he went to Europe, went to England, there was no more any doubt to be given. He'd gone over to the enemy. And it's still, my view is, that only by recapturing him and knowing his psychology and putting him under adult supervision, so to speak, of his own cabinet and other competent people in the government, could we actually rescue this United States from this situation. That's my practical policy now. I'm not saying I'm promising that's going to happen. I'm saying that's what I'm trying to make happen. And I have a whole circle of people who are very close to that administration, who were originally going to be the advisors to Obama. And they've been shunted aside, just as Volcker was, shunted aside. Now, Volcker I often disagree with, but the man is competent, and he's honest. So you can fight with him all day long and disagree with him, but you respect the fact that he's honest and he's competent. And therefore you want to be able to argue with a guy like that because something good is going to come out of it, even if he continues to be wrong. The very discussion will be fruitful in clarifying the issues and bringing people into the deliberation we need. So it's not a hopeless situation. It's a desperate one. It's like a war which we haven't won, which we could lose. And my concern is to save the United States. My hope is the only rational way without chaos is to have these bums like Larry Summers and the other clowns, a few of them, out of there. And I think the rest of the administration can put the president into captivity, so to speak. That is adult supervision, to cause him to make decisions, only decisions, which are not really harmful, and also some decisions which are essential. The key thing I concentrate upon is the only way we can save this planet, because the entire planet is going into a dark age. Now you have China, 1.4 billion people. India, 1.1. Russia is not a populous nation, but has tremendous territory with tremendous raw materials development, and also cultural skills. If you can put these together with the United States in an effort to make a new initiative in terms of an international credit system, we can save the situation. It's clear to me we can save it right now. It won't be magic. It won't be prosperity all at once, but we can stop the bleeding and go back in a different direction up. Under these conditions, party doesn't mean anything. You had the head of the Democratic Party was a fascist at the time that Roosevelt was inaugurated. They had to get rid of him. You have the same thing on the Republican Party. I'm not too strong on partisanship. I believe if you're working in a party, you have to work within the party. But your objective is not to establish the victory of one party over the other. The objective of the political process is to bring people together out of the selection of the process of dialogue and to get up with a bipartisan solution, not as a compromise, but as a constructive step forward, to get people in a time of crisis, when an emergency is on, to act to save this nation and to bind themselves together for the common purpose of saving this nation and doing some good for the world at the same time. That's my perspective.
All right, Yes, right down here. Yes. One of my students, so.
Thank you. Yes, my question is regarding Pakistan. What do you think will happen in Pakistan, and who is behind the Taliban, the weapons and the funds?
Well, the Taliban is an organization which is actually created as a part of the Afghanistan war that the Soviets were involved in. And it was done by the Saudis with about Wahhabi school techniques. Pakistan was already disintegrating in some respects. It was not disintegrated, but it was in a very precarious situation. Now, the turning point for the present crisis in Pakistan was the dumping of Musharraf. I'm not saying that Musharraf was a great hero. I was saying that he was capable of keeping the country together. And the concern I have is to prevent Pakistan from disintegration. The disintegration of Pakistan would cause a mess beyond belief. Now, the Taliban is a force which is controlled by the wrong side in Saudi Arabia. And that's the danger. It's where the Israeli role of the present Israeli government is crucial, because the Israeli government can take actions, despite the impotence of the government in global terms, to take actions which set forth a fire, which play upon the crisis in Pakistan, together with the British interest there. The other problem is the drug problem. Since the 1790s, the British Empire has been based on drugs. It's been the world's big drug trafficker. You want to ban drugs, you sort of have to put the Queen of England in a little cage, because she's shrinking now. The cage doesn't have to be too big. And in that case, what we should be fighting, we should not have troops in Afghanistan. We're stupid to have troops in Afghanistan. It's provocative. The British are sitting upon the area of Afghanistan in which the greatest drug production is occurring. What they have is slaves in there who, with the threat of a gun, are producing opium at a low price, actually a slave price, for British consumption. The British then take this stuff and transport it out of Afghanistan, into Europe as the international drug trade, so that a farmer in Afghanistan, who in the British-controlled area, where British troops control the area, not the other part, are growing opium, and they're getting maybe a few $100s worth for a year's crop. When that year's crop hits the European market, it's in millions of dollars. The entire world economy, largely controlled by the British, by George Soros, for example, who's a British agent, or Malek Brown of the British Colonial Office, are the biggest drug runners in the world today. And they destroy people, as the way that China was destroyed in the 19th century by the drug running. If the place to hit the drug traffic is not in the consumption within the country or the growth in the country, the place to hit the drug traffic is the international trade. What crosses the border, get them at the border, as they used to say in Hollywood, cut them off at the pass, get them at the border. And that's where the problem lies. So we can stabilize that area with the right cooperation. We were injured very badly, which I think people in India and elsewhere agree now. And the Taliban problem also understood, is taken into account. We are endangered by the fact we had a Musharraf who may not have been perfect, but he at least was a factor of stability. And the first thing you want to do to save a country is to ensure its stability. If it's flying apart, you're not going to save anything. And the problem now, the Taliban factor, is being used by the British, operating from their base in the vicinity of Afghanistan, to operate the whole operation. If we can bring forces together to recognize that problem, we can bring it under control. Not perfectly. Mrs. Clinton had a good idea, which he went into this area. Peace with Iran is extremely important. You want to control the problem in this area? You've got to work with Iran. You want war with Iran? Don't worry about the nuclear power. That's not the issue. If anybody starts a nuclear war, the world's going to go up in flames. You don't have to punish any one country. It won't do any damn good. Because if you start a nuclear war, it's going to be a thermonuclear war. And guess who will be alive at the end of that?
How about a question from a young lady? Or almost young lady.
Well, all right, Felton, you're not a young lady, but I'm calling on you. No jokes about it.
My particular question would go back to the Roosevelt administration. You basically seem to be somewhat critical about it, but it seemed to be one of the most democratized eras in our country, saved us certainly from the Hoover administration. Number one, it was the first time in America that we had a black cabinet led by Mary McLeod Bethune. In addition to that, basically it brought about serious economic reform, and that it brought Social Security not as a extreme sense of retirement, that was not the intent, but certainly economic relief, the Agricultural Adjustment Association, farmer subsidies, increased housing benefits in slum areas. And then particularly looking at the Obama administration, he seems to be a prototype of Roosevelt, especially in the context that, first of all, he's a new president. I think the verdict is too early out to basically say that he's a failure as well as his advisors. But at least he has a vision for a future of economic reform. If you could speak to those issues while you think that the Roosevelt administration, number one, was a failed policy, and the president of Social Security and other economic benefits, and why you're so critical of the Obama administration, especially when you think Hillary Clinton was so wonderful after all.
Frankly, there's nothing good about Obama at this time, since he left for London. And he's not his own man. He's a puppet. And he's controlled by a bunch of people around him. The only way you can save Obama, and without losing the nation at the same time, is to put him under adult supervision and take away that crowd of fascists, that Nazi types, and the so-called behaviorists, and Larry Summers. Get them out, and then there are options. If you don't get them out, I don't think there are any options. You may go to hell. None.
If I could just have a counter question, are you promoting the idea that if he needs adult supervision, this is a sort of era of infantilization? Is he more like a child, or can he not think for himself? Is he not seen as a serious leader? I mean, being a Harvard graduate and also coming out of London.
He cannot think. He cannot think for himself. I've seen that. He can't think for himself. He's a narcissist type. He doesn't know what he's saying half the time. He's saying words for self-adulation. And in a university environment, you get some people who can pass the course. They study to pass the course, they rehearse to pass the course, but they end up knowing nothing. Obama learned how to pass the course. And he's had a real problem. He's got an ego problem, which is not just an ego problem. It's a pathological problem. But knowing such types, and you have to be precise in this matter, knowing such types, if he's under adult supervision by a group of peers who constitute the presidency, it can work. Remember that our presidency is not based on an individual president. Roosevelt and Lincoln were geniuses. It's different. But our presidency is based on an in-depth organization of the presidency itself as an institution. Obama is running loose away from the presidency. He's not responding to the presidency. He's out on his own with not a clear idea in his head on anything. He's like having a lunatic loose in the thing. But you put this guy under adult supervision, he's a smart guy to adapt to his environment, as you see from his university record. He'll adapt. But therefore you have to control what he's being adapted to. On his own, he is a disaster for all humanity. And on his own, there is no remedy for that.
Next question.
Dick.
Mr. LaRouche, I think as I said to you earlier, universities are the place for dissent. And I have to dissent from your view. And I don't need the applause. My dissent is this. if you provide us with an intellectual reason for ascribing to any of our humanity that someone who the country elects as a majority vote needs an adult supervisor, that is very demeaning. And I would hope that out of respect for the office that you speak to, if you give me an intellectual reason for that characterization, I would say fine, but you've made an assignation without substance. So I would like you to respond to what is the intellectual basis for your characterization of Mr. Obama?
Well, there are two things about him. First of all, is the way he responds to the situation. And the second thing is what he's responding to is what he's not responding to. Huh? That's what you've got. Two things to consider at that time. Now, the point is what he's doing as a policy, as his specific economic policy now and his social policy now, is insane. The policy itself is insane. Not only is it insane, but if that policy is successful, we aren't going to have a United States. There won't be a nation. These think, for example, let's take this case of this crazy thing of this behaviorist type, like Larry Summers. This man is evil. That is, what we're now in a point of a great world depression. You look at all the figures, everything is collapsing. Why is it collapsing? Well, it's collapsing because we destroyed the productive powers of labor. We went with policies which did not increase the productive powers of labor. What we're getting in this crazy disease problem now, which is going to get worse, is a result of that. This kind of problem, this disease problem, first of all, is a product of globalization, which admittedly he didn't develop. When you get the idea that you're going to globalize the economy by growing food in a country which is not going to eat it, to sell to a country which is going to eat it, and to control the market, world market, by this kind of operation, you're getting the result you're getting. You look at the question of the energy flux density of the economy. Our productivity, as measured in energy flux density, is collapsing. There's no hope for the country if we continue this way. We are on the road to hell. I've gone through this and I've written about this. The facts are clear. We're on the road to hell. Unless if what it looked like when he came in, particularly before he went to London, it looked as though he was going to adapt to a Franklin Roosevelt orientation, as poorly as whatever as he understood it. Now that is workable. That's where your thesis comes in. Presuming he had good intentions, you don't attack him. I didn't attack him as long as I thought he had good intentions. And the policies they had are criminal. They're criminal in their effect. Look at the thing what he says about health care. His statement about his grandmother, things like that. Look at what his policies are on health care. Look at his policies on these things. These are murderous. This is Hitler kind stuff. I mean, this is objectively Hitler kind of stuff. Our policy is always to develop the minds and abilities of our people. And health care is a key issue here. Do we realize what's happening to the health care of the people of the United States now? What has been happening? Well, we came out of the war, we had a general hospital system, which we used as the model for our post-war health care policy. We developed on that model the best health care system essentially in the world for a mass population. We have now destroyed that, or changed in philosophy. We had a protectionist policy of increasing the productive powers of labor in every section of the country. We have neglected and abandoned whole sections of the country. We've confined productive forces to a very limited part of the labor force and the country. We have people who used to commute to work within a half an hour or 15 minutes each way in their community. We now have up to 2 hours, 2.5 hours commuting to and from work in large parts of the country where the production employment is concentrated. Most of the employment is white-collar employment or similar kinds of services employment. We aren't producing our own things. We shipped our industries out. And we shipped them out so they worked at a lower price, but they're also less productive. The Chinese are less productive than we were in our industries. We've lost our machine tool capability. The heart of our economy was in the automobile industry, not because it belonged there, because that was all that was left to speak of. Our aerospace and automobile industry were the heart of our industrial technology. We are now sinking that. We're destroying it. What we need to do is reverse the policy changes which came into effect between 1968 in 1973 and recognized that the policies which we had then in the 1970s and the 1980s were disasters. They led into the equivalent of a depression in October of 1987. Then we had Greenspan with his crazy policy. It completely ruined us with pure gambling, a gambling casino. We now, look at what's happened since then. I proposed an action in July 27th of 2007. It would have worked. A different policy was approached. We're now in a disaster. We are hopelessly bankrupt now. That's the issue. These are concrete facts. And these are all, Volcker comes in presumably as an advisor to the president on banking policy. Now, I don't always agree with Volcker, but he's an honest and capable man. And he's a man, if you disagree with him, you argue with him. You may not come to an agreement, but the disagreement is useful because he's an honest man and he has some understanding of what the subject matter is. Obama dumped him. He dumped all the advisors who were competent and placed them with this bunch of clowns, these behaviorist nuts, all engineered around Larry Summers. And you look at Harry Summers' record, you say, well, this guy is a guy you can trust? I knew him from the Clinton administration. He was a disaster there. He was the guy that destroyed Glass-Steagall. We wouldn't have the mess we have today but for his effect in Glass-Steagall. These are all concrete acts, decisions. They're subject to reason. And my examination of this, from a standpoint of reason, is this is disaster. If Obama were humble, at least a reasonable degree of humility, and after all, Abraham Lincoln was pretty humble, but he knew what he was doing, but he had humility toward people around him. He put up with a cabinet that was a mess in order to get the country pulled together. So the fact of the matter is the present policy of the United States is toward doom. And we are in worse situation than we were under Bush, not better. And my conviction is that if Obama was with his narcissist tendency, with that tendency, if he's under control of a peer group control of competent people in his cabinet and around the federal system itself, we can't, because we don't want to kick a person out of the presidency after they've just been elected. Therefore, we find a way of controlling the situation and use him and let him be happy in being used in the sense of still being president. It's the best thing I can offer.
We'll take two more questions, here and then here. Yes, we'll take three more questions, Gerald. You can have the last one. You're welcome.
If we are headed towards economic disaster at this juncture, and we may very well be, I somehow do not think that Barack Obama has been the man driving that bus. And with all due respect to you, I didn't find anything in your answer to Dick of specificity about policy in regards to Barack Obama. I didn't find any specificity at all. I wasn't even going to engage that. I had a completely different question, but I had to comment on it. I generally agree with you on the need to look at things in this world in a far more global manner, and that the Middle East, the way that you premised your discussion about the Middle East not being the center of this issue, but rather being a component of the larger world issue, I couldn't agree with you more. I think that if European and nations in the United States put more pressure and had constructive efforts, that we could solve some of the problems there. But, and I also agree with you in terms of, I didn't think you used the word, but I think what you were pointing towards was a concept of oligarchy that exists in the world with these corporate conglomerates that control everything.
Yeah.
Yet where I have a great difficulty is that you seem to think that Obama or Franklin Roosevelt or anybody else in this day and age can somehow pull many of these world leaders together into a room and wave a magic wand, or through their wisdom and humility, get people to buy in. I mean, oligarchs are about power and money. And how are you going to change that fundamental cultural problem, that fact What are you going to do about that? And I mean, and within that, you stated that, you know, a democratic process, a party process is about compromise. And I know a little bit about the history of the American political system. And it has primarily been one of conflict. Roosevelt did not get what he got done very easily. I mean, did he get a lot done? Sure he did. But it was not simple for him. And, you know, in terms of, you know, you talked about Hamilton and a credit system, and he most definitely created a monetary policy, and Hamilton's goal was to create a United States in the image of Great Britain. He looked towards Great Britain. He wanted to create a manufacturing society. So, you know, I find your extrapolation on history overall, a lot of the specificity to be pretty off the mark. I mean, I would really love to hear what my colleague who studies British Empire thinks.
Well, actually, the introduction of industrial society occurred in England under the direction of Benjamin Franklin. Franklin led the team which started the canal, coal, etc. business of central England. He was also associated with Watt and others who were part of the same team. So you had a French-British crowd. Remember, my ancestry is also partly English, you know, and also some Scottish, and a bit of French, and a taint of Irish here and there. So that's not a problem for me. The British people are not a problem for me, the English people. They have problems enough of their own without having problems for me. However, the government, the management, the oligarchy is a problem. In this case, you've got to understand the role of leadership. We live in a society in which has been influenced by the Paolo Sarpi, with the decline of Aristotelian society, which is no damn good. But you had the introduction of Paolo Sarpi's system, which we call liberalism today. And liberalism, as in the case of people like John Locke, for example, who's an example of this, and he engaged in the slave trade. That was his mentor. And he was often accused of being the author of our system of government. He was not. He was a slave trader. He was evil. Then you had others who, no, the others, these...
Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence, and he was a slave trader.
I know that's his weakness, wasn't it? And it showed up later. It showed up in his presidency, and it showed up, he began to correct it in the time after the War of 1812, 1815. He changed his views under the influence of the incumbent president and John Quincy Adams. Now, there's a continuity. See, you're dealing here not with just personalities, you're dealing with ideas and the generation of ideas. There are certain ideas which work, and ideas are always the action of the individual mind. Discovery of principle is always an action of an individual mind. And the best leaders are those who, in a time of crisis, as individual minds, are able to be the spark plug of ideas which organize society in response to confidence in their leadership to get things done. This is not the usual thing. We had very few U.S. presidents who were really geniuses. We had a few. We had some who were geniuses some of the time and not at others also. McKinley was, in a sense, a genius. He was also a weakling in some respects. But his killing was a disaster for our nation. The key thing is ideas. The key thing is principles. The problem is that under liberalism, we look at this thing as pieces that are scattered about. We pull some pieces together. It's a so-called democratic process. It's not really democratic. It's liberalism. It's the denial of the knowledge of scientific principle. For example, what do we teach in science as an example of problems? What we teach generally is mathematical formulas, or mathematical formulations, backed up by experiments which demonstrate that that formula happens to work. Or we develop a formula that, according to something that does work. But we do not usually think, as classical scholars did, since Plato and so forth, we don't think in terms of the discovery of the principle of something which is outside the experiment itself, but which demonstrates how it's controlled. And when you're designing a change in society, and we're talking about a period now of change, you have to introduce considerations which are contradictory to the underlying axiomatic assumptions of society today. Why are we in a mess? For example, let's take the case of my expertise in forecasting. I've been forecasting the U.S. economy since the middle of the 1950s, and I've always been right. And everyone who's forecast contrary has always been wrong. Why? Because our people think forecasting is statistical forecasting. They think that you can induce a trend in the economy by following the monetary and correlated kinds of considerations. I say no. From my study of economy, my forecasting is based on that we, by adopting certain assumptions, which we call policies, whether we are conscious of these policies or not, that those assumptions steer us repeatedly into crises. Any assumption which is based on the assumption that money is a determinant of value is such a case. Money is not a determinant of value. It is in the minds of some people. It's their response to it as if it were value. But when you look at a physical economy, you find it's not true. To use money as a medium of exchange, yes, it's a good idea. It's a necessary idea. But to assume that therefore the money and the value of money determines value is wrong. That's why I've always been successful in forecasting, because I know that certain policies which have been adopted determine the life cycle of certain developments, not monetary or statistical trends. And therefore, the important thing in government, especially in time of crisis, is recognize if we have a crisis, it's because our thinking was wrong. And you need an idea which not only changes the way we think, but which is a correct change, or at least a useful one. Right now, the thing is, we have a monetary system. You have idiots are trying to fix up the monetary system, adjust it, by going into tremendous debt, hyperinflationary debt. We're generating a hyperinflation like Weimar Germany out of this kind of so-called debt policy. And therefore, you're going to see a hyperinflation very quickly in the United States if this thing continues. We'll blow up with hyperinflation. We're on the verge of that right now. You'll find admission of an inflationary tendency now coming forth, just as in Germany under Weimar conditions. First, you get a depression. Now you sink the production. Then you put in money to try to keep the economy going, to pay debts, refinancing debts. So now you have your production is falling, your monetary aggregate is rising. But that accelerates the process. So now you begin to collapse more, as in Germany in the early 1920s. Then you accelerate the monetary emission as credit in order to compensate for that. Then you get hyperinflation. We are now at the pivot point of a hyperinflationary explosion if we continue the present policy. And the President of the United States is determined to continue that policy. There are some people in our community who are supposed to be the economic advisors of the President who have been excluded, who understand this, but they've been excluded along with these nuts associated with the behaviorist economists and Larry Fried. This is the problem. So in a time of crisis, it is not opinion, it is not averages, it is not trends that count. What counts is very precise understanding of what the wrong policy has been and what the correct change is. That's our situation now. I could get us out of this mess if I were president. No problem with that. And I have the people I'm associated with now in our discussion of these matters who are formerly part of this group that was supposed to advise the president. We could solve the problem. We would go with a credit system, as I described it, a Hamiltonian type of credit system, as what the Constitution really means, contrary to some other interpretations. On that case, we would have to generate, at this point, to save the civilization, we'd have to think in terms of periods of credit at low interest rates of 50 to 100 years. Because what you have to do, there's no way we can bail China out. China's on the road to go to hell. And the only way you can bail China out is to realize you've got a fundamental problem. There are a lot of poor people in there. And what they were doing was something which was actually fake. It was short-term. To use China as a substitute for production of American goods and similar kinds of goods. Now that has collapsed. The market for that production has collapsed. The United States has collapsed in terms of its ability to do that. There's no market for those Chinese goods. What's the market for? The only market lies in infrastructure, basic economic infrastructure of a type that develops a higher technological level in the Chinese population. You're talking about 2 generations or more. Russia is not a population problem. Russia is a development of raw materials. Under the Russian territory and associated parts of the former Soviet Union, one of the greatest concentrations of resources on this planet. Those resources can build up the economy of the world. So you have a combination of India, China, Russia. Japan comes in automatically. Korea comes in automatically. So therefore, we can, if we organize a system of credit at between 1.5% and 2% interest, simple interest, on a long-term basis, through treaty agreements of the type we do with our treaty negotiations, we could create the credit. And I know personally, we could get from Russia in particular, we could get the agreement to go with that kind of a program. If we did that, we would immediately turn the tide on the present process. The process is not a statistical process. It should not be seen as statistical. It is actually making policy decisions, particularly involving credit, which enable us to steer the world economy in a direction. Because with the way we're going now, there's nothing in the system, the way it's going now, that's going to save us from a general breakdown crisis. It's the first general breakdown crisis in all modern history.
All right, 2 more. Gerald will get to you. 2, down here. Okay. Oh, well, wait a minute. What? Wait a minute. Raise your hands, the ones that want to ask questions. You already recognized, did I? No. All right, we have, well, all right, Gerald, you've got the microphone. You're next, and I'll try to come back.
Hi, I'm Gerald Duquette. I teach in political science. I don't claim to be the brightest bulb on the Christmas tree, but I really have tried hard to listen and pay attention to the lecture. I tried to take some notes. And I'm struck by the difficulty of listening to your remarks because someone who's trying to listen critically is sort of interrupted every few minutes with some personal characterization that you throw in as some type of fact. And while I'm trying to understand your argument, you tell me some guy's a disaster, or he's the evil, or he's the devil, or some other thing that I personally couldn't ascertain through any methods that I know of. So I wonder if you have superpowers, or and the problem is that I'm distracted from what might well be a fine argument. And as I'm listening and struggling to get past characterizations that I know to be foolish to sort of get to the meat of your argument, I ask myself, how would I grade a student presentation with this kind of material in it? What would I do if a student claimed to know that a person is evil or is a total disaster or the sort of over-the-top characterizations of individuals, which I don't understand how there could be a basis, in fact, for such characterizations. My question to you is, tell me, a classroom instructor, how your style of delivery, which may be masking arguments that I would have thought interesting, how that's helping students in the audience to understand how to make cogent arguments. In other words, my problem isn't that you're making crazy arguments. Your remarks about the Middle East are not only conventional, they're very common. So there's nothing unique about those. But they were interesting and at some level thoughtful. But your characterizations from start to finish of various people, from Bismarck to everybody, you seem to have knowledge of things that only they in their minds could know. I thought it was interesting that you characterized as factual people's intentions. And so I wonder, when I'm trying to explain the difference between facts and subjective criteria, how is your lecture going to help me? How are you going to help me to teach undergraduates to think clearly and not to take specific instances and imbue them with worlds of significance, or not to make comments about someone's personality you couldn't possibly have substantive knowledge of and then call that a piece of factual data? So, in other words, I'm distracted by all that. How can you cut through all that and tell me what you really want to say?
Well, I told you what I really wanted to say. Okay, no, it's very simple. You're underestimating what I do and what I base this on. That everything I've said is based on fact, is based on my experience with this process, which most people in this room are not experienced with. But it's my business to represent what I know. Now, in a situation like this with a limited time scale, you have two problems. You have to say what is true, and you have to say it in a summary fashion, and don't say if it's not true. That's my standard. I've said nothing to you, I've said nothing to this audience which is not factually true to my knowledge.
Your knowledge?
That's right.
You don't understand the difference between truth and fact, then.
I do.
Because you can't factually characterize someone's intentions unless you are in their head.
Oh, yes, you can.
Oh, no, you can't.
Well, sometimes we do that with, sometimes,
I hope that any student in the audience is not being fooled by that insane comment.
it's not insane.
That it is a fact that I am now intending something.
Well,
I'm intending something.
how do you tell the opinion of a toad and a centipede? Can you talk to either of them?
Is that a non sequitur?
No, it is not. I mean, the point is, how do you tell the intention of a toad? That's by the way in which the actions are organized. You see, the point is, no, those are facts. No, you misunderstand facts. Now,
Why should I be different than he? He didn't come here to hear you talk.
now you.
Gerald, thank you for letting him answer. He's going to answer now. Thank you very much. Yeah, Gerald.
Oh, no, you maybe I have. You just haven't listened to it. Now listen, Gerald. Listen. Hey, quiet down. Calm down. Well, get calm. It's good for you. It's better for your cardiac health and well-being. The point is, what you're dealing with, we're dealing with a society which you're talking about and defending, and very angry about the fact that I've impinged my views on it. Because you're talking about a liberal view of fact and reality. I don't accept the liberal view of fact and reality. In fact, I know better. That, for example, take a case, you probably know something about this. Take the case of dynamics. What's the difference between Descartes and Leibniz? What is Leibniz's attack on Descartes? Why is Descartes a faker? Because of the method he uses, which is the method you're defending. The assumption of self-evident fact, as if it were a little ball being kicked around someplace. What determines the course of history is, and as in physical processes, is what's called dynamics. This is not something I invented. This is well known in history, for example, in the work of the Pythagoreans and Plato. The concept of dynamis. It's the concept of Shelley, Percy Bysshe Shelley, in the concluding paragraph of his defense of poetry. That there are dynamical processes, as he emphasizes, in the creative moments of mankind, where we see a principle being expressed by a population. But not all the people who express that opinion, as a result, share the motive which leads to it. And yet the greatest moments in history come from that kind of inspiration. Therefore, there are certain kinds of ideas which empiricists do not accept, as you don't.
But just use a different word then.
No, it's not.
You use a word that has a meaning that you don't agree with. Everyone else hears fact. They thought that you were talking about a fact.
I am talking about a fact.
No, you're talking about a dynamic truth.
That's it. No, dynamics is a fact.
No.
Well,
No, there's a definition for the word fact, and you're not using it.
I don't.
All I'm asking you is use the right word.
Gerald, maybe I can convince the people here to have you give the first lecture next year, and then we can listen to you. Let him answer, and we'll go to the last one. Gerald, you had your say. Answer him briefly, and we'll go to two more questions.
Okay. Well, look, the point is, you don't understand or accept the concept of dynamics. What you're expressing, what you're doing.
All right, we're going to the next person for the question. Yes, right. Yes, here, right here, and then we'll go back. You're already in the back. We're coming to you next because we haven't had a lady yet. No, wait a minute. We're going back first, then you're going to ask the last one.
I thought that was the last one.
No. You put yourself, Gerald, out. All right, Gerald, we're going on. Please, Gerald. Gerald, you're part of our good faculty here. Yes, thank you. Here. Next question. Next question. Next question.
Shysters say stuff that's ridiculous. Get in there and try to help show some reality. You're making that part of my job.
You've told us that 6 times. Next question.
Yes, I would like to return to something Mr. LaRouche had said earlier. Would you explain to, for those who might not know, what the Julian the Apostle, apostate philosophy is being used by the British oligarchy?
Yeah. This is a general principle of imperial oligarchy, which is, Julian was not unique in this, but he's famous for it. And therefore he's much quoted because he's the simplest illustration of the case. He's such a clear-cut case that he's used by the British and others to explain the point. What has happened is the use of religion and beliefs which have the character of religious choices as opposed to scientific choices as a basis for organizing conflict in society. And thus, by using these differences to put one part of society against the other, you're able to distract the attention of society from the common issue, the problem of society, and you're distracted by fighting one another over these issues, these so-called religious issues. For example, in the history of religion, or the modern history of religion, the concept of ecumenicism, as in Cousé's notion of de pace fide, the peace among religions, is an essential principle of the state, of society. You must have peace among religions. Because that is the way, the disruption of peace among religions is the way in which mankind is set against mankind. Therefore, you can allow religions, but you cannot allow them to be used to one group of people to attempt to destroy the other, particularly within the same society. Now, you have, in addition to religions, you have phenomena which have a religious character, such as liberalism. Now, take the case, what is liberalism? And in this room, I think everybody's been exposed, heavily dosed, to liberalism, because this is what is taught in most universities and is most popular in English-speaking society and other parts of society, as distinct from a very special kind of liberalism called positivism. In these societies, Paolo Sappi based himself on the religious irrationalism of a medieval character. And this was his system of society. His argument was, and the argument of his Galileo and other followers and accomplices of Sappi, is that mankind must not be allowed to know principles, such as scientific principles. However, what Sappi did, which is why he was able to defeat the Aristotelians in the period of the religious war from 1492 to 1648, was he said that what was happening in that period was that the influence of Cousé's reform, as carried out by people like Louis XI and carried out by Henry VII of England, that these reforms had promoted a great spirit of innovation in the people who had been largely treated as serfs. And you had, especially centered in the cities, in a movement which was unleashed by Louis XI of France and also by Henry VII in England. The ordinary people, the serf-like people of the cities and the countryside, who had been oppressed as serfs, now were participating in the process of innovation. And as was, and Machiavelli pointed out in his military studies, what had happened was that the armies of the Habsburgs, in particular, going into the field of battle with serried ranks as they were supposed to be, were losing the war while winning many of the battles. And the reason was the ordinary people, as was pointed out by Machiavelli, the ordinary people of the cities as artisans were now becoming innovative. And therefore, in dealing with the Habsburg attacks, they were able to innovate in ways which outwitted the dumb organization of the troops of the Habsburgs. So what the compromise that came up with Sappi said, okay, we will allow innovation, we will not allow science. We will not allow Cusa, Nicholas Cusa, which is science. We will allow mechanical innovation, or we will selectively allow it if we don't think it's bad for us. And we will use that, that toleration for innovation, which is what is called the Anglo-Dutch liberal principle, which dominates the United States thinking in universities and elsewhere today. We will allow people to innovate and to come up with mathematical formulas, but we will now let them come up with the concept of principle as such. And that's the point. Now, this was the issue between these liberals and actually Kepler, who discovered gravitation. They didn't. And Leibniz, who developed modern science. They didn't. And Riemann, who actually developed modern science further, and they didn't. And Einstein, who defended these guys from Kepler through Riemann, and they didn't. And so therefore the idea of principle as such, as a concept, as a factual concept, does not exist in liberalism. And when you come up with a proof of principle of this type, which is alien to liberalism, you get a liberal freak-out over the fact that you've raised something which is provable, and they say it's not provable because it's not a fact in the sense of liberalism as Paolo Sappi defined it. And that's what the issue is.
All right. We're going to take the final question. The young lady. No, wait a minute. You need a microphone. You need you need a microphone.
Hello? Okay.
That's better.
I'm just trying to resolve the conflict. If Mr. LaRouche had said, in talking about certain people, I have studied this person, I have studied what this person has said and done, and based on my observations and my experience, I conclude that this person is acting like you fill in the blank. The trouble with brilliant people is they're 2 steps ahead of the ordinary thinker, and they don't like to explain themselves, I think, based on my experiences.
Well, what you say as a principle is absolutely true, and that's exactly what I've done. However, I also stated some very important principles which are strange to some people because they haven't heard this kind of argument perhaps before. And therefore, what they want, they need more elaboration. And I can give it. I've given it in things I've published. I have said nothing here in terms of principle, which I have not said many places, and I've presented the proof of this thing. In the case, for example, the study of Obama. I did an extensive study of Obama in an area which I have specialized qualifications. I reckon.
How long have you studied him?
What?
He just became president. How long have you ever just...
I've studied him for long before he became president.
I look forward to that publication.
I want to read that.
Yeah, it's already been said. I gave a 3.5-hour webcast.
Academics have standards, sir. And if you
Well, this was. You've got a problem, Gerald. You can't listen.
Well, let him. You want to finish, Linda?
I just finished quickly. It's just,
All right, he's going to finish the answer.
okay. I've already published, it's on record, extensive studies in detail. As I say, I just gave on the 11th of this past month, I gave a 3.5-hour presentation to a group of leading scholars and others on these kinds of questions. There's no mystery about it. They're documented. It's available on the public record. And when I present a summary here, in a short period of time, I identify what I've said. And the backing for what I've said as to how I reach these conclusions is in the public domain. It's widely available in the public domain. I've gone through all the stages you indicated, and it's available to anyone. They got a question, postpone the freak out until you've looked at the evidence.
All right. Gerald, if you want the citation, come up here.
Why can't you just tell us from the podium? I can write it down, go to the library.
Gerald, you can walk. Thank you very much. Thank you, Lyndon LaRouche.